when someone's going to get injured is one, the longer the distances that you paddle, and then two, the asymmetry between your limbs. Asymmetry between your limbs meaning the difference between their flexibility and the strength. If your right hand is much more flexible than your left hand, you're much more likely to injure that left hand when you're paddling. So people that are in sprint disciplines and slalom disciplines are much less likely to injure their shoulders, low back, wrists, forearms, simply because they don't have the amount of volume. They're not spending as much time on the water. The more time that you have on the water, the more likely it is that you will end up having an overuse injury. The other thing that paddlers are prone to are postural distortion syndromes. These are long-term built-up things. You might have heard of them before. Has anybody ever heard of a postural distortion syndrome? Like ever talked to a PT or a chiropractic? Has anybody ever heard of kyphosis or lordosis from their doctors? Those are postural distortion syndromes. So a kyphosis is an excessive curvature of your upper back. A lordosis is an excessive curvature of your lower back. And the big things that are going to cause that for your kyphosis, there, all right, would be that your pectoralis muscle is super tight, and so is your upper traps, which would be right up here. And then much weaker than that would be your neck flexors and your rhomboids, which are smaller muscles that are underneath the traps. So what happens is that if you're sitting at a desk all day, or if you're sitting in your boat all day, what happens is that you're using those pecs, you're using those lats, those big muscles, they're getting stronger and tighter and stronger and tighter, and it's pulling you forward, and you're neglecting to use muscles that would be pulling you back into an upright position. The tighter those muscles are, the more likely you are to develop an impingement syndrome or something else, rotator cuff injuries, tears. For your lower body, we have a similar problem with that lordosis. So if you're sitting in a boat all day, it's the same as being seated in an office scenario. So you've got muscles on the front of your hips, your hip flexor muscles that are tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. You're using them all day. They don't get an opportunity to extend and get stretched out. Or even at the end of the day, a lot of people don't stretch their hip flexor muscles. Your glutes are getting longer and longer and longer and longer in comparison, and thereby weaker. And your low back is also getting tight, and your abdominals are getting weak. So those things together are going to increase the curvature of your low back, puts you at risk for disc issues, low back pain, and long term, the low back pain is the #1 reason why Americans will miss out on work or stop sporting activities. If we can get people to keep themselves from hurting their low backs, awesome. That's the best thing that we can hope for. So how do we prevent these? One, we want to directly strengthen the muscles that are at risk. We want to strengthen the rhomboids, which are underneath your traps. We want to strengthen your neck flexors. We want to strengthen your abdominal muscles. We want to strengthen your glutes. And we want to decrease the tightness of your pecs, lats, hip flexors. And then the other thing that we want to work on is scapular mobility. Does anybody feel like they've got tight shoulders? So if we can, a lot of people have what's called scapular dyskinesis. Even in young adults, the lack of an ability to move your shoulder blades through a full range of motion is something that stops you from being able to do what you need to do during these activities. Thoracic extension. Your thoracic spine is about from here to here. If you can't get your thoracic spine to extend, we need to work on the mobility of that. And then core strength and stability. Those all have a symbiotic role in preventing injury. Now, I'd like to get out of that, through the weeds of the injury prevention, the energy requirements. I want to get actually into program design. How are you going to use the science of exercise physiology, biomechanics, motor learning, all that good stuff? The first step of any good program is exercise testing. Has anybody here ever done a full exercise test? One? Anybody? 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so were those exercise tests that you did VO2 max tests? VO2 max? Is everybody here familiar with what a VO2 max test is? It's an awesome test, and it's incredible. It's a measurement of your aerobic capacity. So it's the volume of oxygen that your body's capable of taking in and then using as useful energy. You can get it done at local gyms. You can get it done at your doctor's office. And if you know the protocols, you can actually do them on your own time and get pretty accurate results. So if you take a VO2 max test, we can use it to prescribe what kind of aerobic exercise would be appropriate for you. How do you know what 60% of your max is, 70% of your max is, 80? Unless you know what your maximum is. Lactate threshold. That's another type of cardiovascular endurance test. Your lactate threshold is the point where your body's no longer capable of clearing out lactate from the working muscle and shuttling it off to the liver where it's reused as energy. And instead it starts to build up in the working muscle. It's what causes that feeling of acidity. It's often the thing that's going to stop you from doing hard work. Knowing how hard you can work before that lactate threshold sets in is another great cue, because that way you know whether you're working at a level where you're using that oxidative system or whether you're using the glycolytic system. And then 3, a test that's specific towards paddling sports and rowing is the 2,000 meter rowing ergometer test. So if you don't have access to laboratory settings or you don't want to use that kind of work, you can just go ahead and use a 2,000, you can just do a rowing machine, row 2,000 meters as fast as you can, check yourself week after week and see if you're improving at that score. And you'll know if you're getting better with your cardiovascular endurance. Muscle strength tests. So the muscle strength tests that we might want to use would be leg press tests, dip tests, and pull-up tests. These are all tests of different large groups in both your lower body and in your upper body. So if you can do those tests, you find out what's the maximum weight that you can push. You can always come back and do those tests again to test the efficacy of the programs you're using. Body composition tests are also very important for a number of reasons. One is that it's a great tool just to know what your body composition is for the long-term health outcomes. But if you are planning on being a competitive athlete, someone that has a lower body fat percentage has a competitive edge over the other competitors in just about every discipline of paddle sports. And then power. Let me just give a quick definition of what power is. It's often confused for other stuff. So power is work over time. If I move 10 meters in 3 seconds, and then I move 10 meters in 1 second, the second time around, I've developed more power. So we often want to measure how much power can you generate with your lower body, or how much power can we generate with your upper body. And so examples of 2 kinds of tests you can do is a counter movement jump, so a vertical jump test. If I had a wall, I could just jump up, see how high I can hit the wall. And a medicine ball put would be where you're seated on a bench that's at a 45-degree angle. You've got a medicine ball at your chest, 10 pounds usually, and then you're going to put it, see how far you can throw the thing. And these are pretty easily replicatable tests that you can do in your home facilities. And the last one is a much newer one, a functional movement screen. Is anybody here familiar with a functional movement screen? I got 1 hand. Okay, so 2 hands. Functional movement screens are pretty interesting. They've been developed by physical therapists over the last couple of years, and I actually found 1 published paper about using functional movement screens for canoeists during competitions. So functional movement screens is a series of about 5 different tests where you have a scale of 0, 1, 2, 3 for whether you can complete the different exercises that are in that test. One would be, say, an overhead squat test. Another would be a hurdle test. When what they're doing is they're testing the range of motion for different joints. You're testing the range of motion so that you can see how strong you are in those positions. And what they find is that there's a very high correlation between how well you do on a functional movement screen, which can take 10 minutes or less, and how well you would do in your paddling. And not only does it work well for canoeists and kayakers and stand-up paddleboarders, it also works well for other athlete populations. And the second thing is, once you've done all of your exercise testing, you want to know, hey, what kind of program can I put together with this information where I can do pre-test and post-test? Periodization is hands down the best way that you can put together an exercise regimen. Periodization is where you manipulate volume and you manipulate intensity for either your aerobic training or for your strength training. Volume would be either the total amount of miles that you're putting in on the boat, on the road, where you're paddling or running, biking, paddling, or the total amount of weight that you're moving. So if I do 3 sets of 10 repetitions with 10 pounds for dumbbell curls, I've moved 3,000 pounds. That would be a measurement of volume. Intensity would be percentages of your VO2 max. So if you have a high volume workout, you have to have a low intensity. They're inversely proportional to one another. You can't have high volume and high intensity. And so the way you would think about this is that over the course of several months, you start off doing high volume workouts, you decrease the volume over time, and then you increase the intensity of the workouts that you're doing. Generally, a periodized program is going to be several months long. And if you were to look into how you put together a periodized program, you would usually have a macro cycle. So if you're a year-long athlete, that macro cycle would last the season. If you're an Olympian, it's 4 years. If you're just looking to put a program together for people before they come on to, say, a Knowles trip or an Outward Bound trip, that macro cycle would be, say, 16 weeks to 20 weeks or 24. Whatever you would want them to be working out for before you send them out into the field. A mesocycle is 1 to several months where you have a preparatory phase, a competitive phase, and a transition phase. The prep phase is the period before you have to do the real work. The competitive phase would be the actual racing periods or the actual time that you're working out or doing your expeditions. And a transition phase is where you deload everything that you've been doing, and it's there for recovery. The reason why you need to have a transition phase is that if I keep increasing the intensity for month after month after month after month, eventually your body breaks down. You have to deload at the end of a program. And then microcycles are usually 1-week programs to 2-week programs where you will break it into discrete parts where this 2-week cycle we're going to work on endurance. This 2-week cycle we are working on strength, power, technical training. Those are the kind of variables that you can play around with. And when it comes to what works best for paddlers, concurrent programs are the ones that seem to work the best. Not just because it's got the word current in it, even though that's a fun thing for me. If you're putting together kinds of programs, there's lots of different ones. You can pick out of, you can do power training, you can do strength training, strength endurance, hypertrophy, aerobic endurance. And you've got all these different types of programs that you can put together. And concurrent training is when you're doing mixed endurance and mixed strength training. You want it where you're doing them both on the same day. And the reason why concurrent training programs work very well is where we're putting together programs where we are trying to reduce the risk of an interference effect. An interference effect is when you are doing mixed strength and mixed aerobic endurance programs, and the type of aerobic endurance that you're doing decreases the strength gains that you get. So concurrent programs are a scientifically validated way to both increase your strength gains and increase your aerobic gains at the same time. And the kind of way that you're going to put it together is that you have two basic options when you're looking at the specificity of what you're going to get out of your training program. So you've got peripheral adaptations, and you've got, which would be in the muscles themselves, and you've got central adaptations. That would be in the heart, the brain, and in the spinal cord. So at the beginning of the training, what we want to be focusing on is local muscular endurance in the muscles themselves. And then for the heart and for the brain, you're looking at high intensities for your aerobic training. If you were to be doing high intensities for your strength training and high intensities for your aerobic training, you have a greater interference effect. And then conversely, if you're doing high repetition loads for your strength training and you're doing less than 90% of your VO2 max, lower aerobic intensities, you have a greater interference effect there as well. So up here is the combination that you would want to be putting together for the kind of rep ranges that you have for your exercises and the intensity levels that you would want for your aerobic training programs. In these concurrent programs, it is not recommended to train to failure. So if you hit 10 repetitions and you want to shoot for 12 but you know you can't do it, don't do it. It's only going to reduce the gains that you would get. Resistance training is going to be 2 to 3 times a week, and the thing that you're going to track is the total volume that you're moving over time. So recommendations for the kind of exercises that you're going to select. What do you want to select? You want to select multi-joint exercises with progression. Progressions are very important because it's a great way to take you from being a novice resistance trainer to being an expert trainer. So 2 limbs become 1 limb. Say instead of overhead pressing with a barbell, you take it to dumbbells eventually. It's harder for your brain to do. Going from stable surfaces to unstable surfaces, doing squats on flat ground, onto Bosu balls, and then even onto the big Swiss balls. going from machines to free weights. Those are examples of typical progressions that you can do